Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where lost truths, ancient mysteries, and forbidden history collide. Let's question the past and uncover what was never meant to be found. On August 21, 1986, a lake in Cameroon exploded without warning. A silent, invisible cloud swept through the valleys, killing 1,746 people and thousands of animals in their sleep. The cause was a mystery from a geological nightmare. On the evening of August 21, 1986, life in the small, remote villages nestled in the verdant highlands of northwestern Cameroon proceeded as it had for generations. The air was calm, the sun had set, and families were gathering in their homes, preparing for the night. The communities of Nyos, Cam, Cha, and Subum were situated in a landscape of breathtaking beauty, a region of rolling hills and lush vegetation dominated by the serene presence of a deep, crater lake known simply as Lake Nyos. The lake was the heart of their world, a source of water and a place of local legend, its tranquil blue surface reflecting the peaceful rhythm of their daily lives. But on this particular evening, that tranquility was shattered by a series of events that would unleash a natural disaster of terrifying and almost unprecedented nature. A silent, invisible killer that would emerge from the depths of the lake and leave behind a scene of unimaginable devastation. The night of the disaster was a moment when a geological nightmare became a human tragedy, transforming a peaceful valley into a silent tomb. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong came in the late evening, around 9:30 p.m. Survivors who were still awake at the time later recounted hearing a strange and prolonged rumbling sound, a deep, guttural noise that seemed to emanate from the direction of the lake. It was not the sharp crack of thunder or the familiar tremor of an earthquake. It was a sustained, bubbling roar that lasted for several minutes. For those living closest to the lake, this sound was accompanied by a more dramatic, invisible phenomenon. Some witnesses reported seeing a tall, white plume of vapor or mist, perhaps hundreds of feet high, rise suddenly from the center of the lake, like a ghostly geyser. At the same time, the waters of the lake were violently agitated. A massive wave, estimated to be over 80 feet high, was generated, crashing against the steep crater walls and sweeping over the northern shore, destroying vegetation and scouring the earth bare. The serene blue lake had, without any apparent warning, erupted. Following this initial violent outburst, something far more sinister and insidious began to happen. From the surface of the agitated lake, a vast and terrifying cloud began to form and flow outwards. But this was not a cloud of smoke or ash from a volcanic eruption. It was a cloud of dense, colorless, and odorless gas. This invisible cloud, being significantly heavier than the surrounding air, did not rise and dissipate into the atmosphere. Instead, it behaved like a liquid, a dense, ethereal river that hugged the ground. It poured over the rim of the crater and began to flow silently and swiftly down the valleys and ravines that radiated outwards from the lake, following the natural contours of the landscape like a ghostly flood. It moved with surprising speed, estimated by scientists to be between 20 and 50 kilometers per hour, a silent, inexorable tide of death. As this invisible cloud descended upon the unsuspecting villages, its effect was immediate and catastrophic. The gas was primarily carbon dioxide (CO2), which, while not poisonous in the traditional sense, is a powerful asphyxiant. In high concentrations, it displaces the oxygen in the air. For the people and animals in the path of the cloud, the very air they were breathing was suddenly replaced by a gas that could not sustain life. The onset of asphyxiation would have been swift. Victims would have experienced a brief moment of dizziness, confusion, and a desperate struggle for breath before losing consciousness and succumbing to death within minutes. Because the gas was odorless and invisible, there was no warning. People sitting in their homes, families gathered around the fire, and those already asleep in their beds were overcome before they even knew what was happening. It was a swift, silent, and terrifying killer. The cloud flowed for a staggering distance, extending up to 25 kilometers from the lake, engulfing everything in its path. It settled in low-lying areas, filling the valleys and depressions where the villages were located. The village of Nyos, situated just below the lake, was the first to be hit and suffered the most complete devastation. The cloud then continued its deadly journey, flowing down the valley to engulf the larger village of Cam, and then further on to Subum. The only survivors were those who were fortunate enough to be on high ground, above the deadly layer of gas, or those on the periphery of the cloud who were exposed to a non-lethal dose. Some survivors recounted a strange metallic or acidic smell, likely the result of the CO2 reacting with the moisture in their noses and mouths to form carbonic acid. Others described a feeling of warmth, followed by a sudden loss of consciousness, only to awaken hours later to a scene of almost unimaginable horror. The full scale of the tragedy only became apparent the following morning, on August 22. As the sun rose, the first survivors began to stir. They awoke to an eerie, unnatural silence. The familiar sounds of a bustling village, the crowing of roosters, the bleating of goats, the voices of neighbors were gone. The world was utterly still. One of the first people to raise the alarm was a man who had been traveling to Nyos on his motorcycle. He had been on a hill overlooking the village when the cloud passed below him, causing him to lose consciousness. When he awoke, he drove down into the village and was met with a scene from a nightmare. The entire village was littered with the dead. People lay where they had fallen, in their doorways, on the paths between houses, inside their homes. Entire families were found dead in their beds. Crucially, there were no signs of violence, no injuries, no destruction to the buildings. The victims appeared as if they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. The devastation was not limited to the human population. The cloud had killed indiscriminately. Thousands of cattle, goats, chickens, and other livestock lay dead in the fields and in their pens. Even the insects and birds had been wiped out. The landscape was transformed into a silent, macabre tableau. As more survivors from the surrounding hills descended and the first outside help began to arrive, the full horrifying picture emerged. The villages of Nyos, Cam, and Subum had been almost entirely wiped out. The final death toll was officially recorded as 1,746 people, and over 3,500 head of livestock. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in the modern history of Africa, made all the more terrifying by its silent, mysterious, and almost supernatural nature. The initial response from the outside world was one of confusion and disbelief. The first reports that reached the Cameroonian government and the international community were fragmented and seemed almost unbelievable. How could an entire region be wiped out overnight without any apparent cause? The lack of any physical destruction to the villages was particularly baffling. The scene did not resemble the aftermath of an earthquake, a flood, or a conventional volcanic eruption. The world was confronted with a profound and terrifying mystery. What had happened at Lake Nyos? What invisible force could have killed so many people and animals so swiftly and so silently? The search for the answer would require a massive international scientific effort, a geological detective story that would ultimately uncover a rare and terrifying natural phenomenon, a killer that lurked not in the sky or on the land, but in the deep, cold, and seemingly tranquil waters of the lake itself. The night of the disaster was a harrowing reminder of the power of the natural world, a moment when a beautiful and serene lake transformed into an explosive, suffocating monster, leaving a legacy of sorrow and a pressing scientific puzzle that demanded to be solved. In the immediate aftermath of the Lake Nyos disaster, the scene that greeted the first responders and scientists was one of surreal and silent horror. The complete absence of physical destruction, coupled with the staggering death toll, presented a chilling and unprecedented puzzle. The world was confronted with a mass casualty event with no obvious cause, a scientific mystery wrapped in a human tragedy. To prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again, it was imperative to understand precisely what had occurred. This launched a major international scientific investigation, a geological detective story that would require experts from multiple fields to piece together the clues, eliminate the red herrings, and ultimately unmask the silent killer. The investigation would reveal that the culprit was not a conventional volcanic eruption or a man-made poison, but a rare and terrifying natural phenomenon known as a limnic eruption, a process that had turned the deep, tranquil lake into a ticking time bomb. The initial wave of theories in the days following the disaster was a mix of plausible science, wild speculation, and Cold War paranoia. The most immediate suspect was a conventional volcanic eruption. Lake Nyos is a crater lake, formed in the caldera of an extinct volcano that is part of a chain of volcanic activity, known as the Cameroon Volcanic Line. It was logical to assume that the volcano had reawakened. This theory suggested that a small eruption beneath the lake had released a cloud of poisonous volcanic gases, such as hydrogen sulfide or sulfur dioxide. These gases, known for their toxicity, could have suffocated the population. Some survivors did report a strange smell, described as being like rotten eggs or gunpowder, which is characteristic of sulfurous compounds. This theory seemed compelling and was widely reported in the initial media coverage. However, as medical teams examined the victims and scientists began to analyze the environmental data, the volcanic gas theory quickly fell apart. The primary evidence against it was the condition of the victims themselves. The bodies showed no signs of the chemical burns or pulmonary edema associated with poisoning by sulfurous gases. The sole cause of death, confirmed by autopsies, was asphyxiation, a simple lack of oxygen. Furthermore, if a significant volcanic eruption had occurred beneath the lake, it would have superheated the water. Yet, when scientists first measured the lake's temperature, it was cool, not hot. The vegetation around the lake was flattened by the wave, but not scorched by heat. There was no evidence of fresh ash or lava. A major volcanic eruption had clearly not taken place. The mysterious nature of the event also gave rise to more sinister and speculative theories. Given the geopolitical climate of the 1980s, some suggested that the disaster was the result of a secret chemical or neutron bomb test conducted by a foreign power. The idea of a bomb that could kill people without destroying buildings seemed to fit the strange circumstances. The Israeli military was even briefly and baselessly implicated. These theories, however, were quickly dismissed. There was no evidence of any military activity in the region, no crater, and no residual radiation. The disaster was clearly a natural phenomenon, but one that was beyond the immediate experience of the scientific community. The key to solving the mystery lay in the water of Lake Nyos itself. When scientists took samples from the lake, they noticed something peculiar. The water fizzed, releasing bubbles like a freshly opened bottle of soda water. This was the first major clue. The gas being released was identified as almost pure carbon dioxide, CO2. Further analysis revealed an astonishing fact. The deep waters of Lake Nyos were massively supersaturated with dissolved CO2. The scientific team began to formulate a new and terrifying hypothesis, one based on a rare phenomenon that had been documented only once before, in a much smaller event at nearby Lake Manaun in 1984. This was the theory of a limnic eruption, or lake overturn. To understand this hypothesis, one must understand the unique limnology of Lake Nyos. Most deep lakes in temperate climates undergo a seasonal turnover. In the fall, the surface water cools, becomes denser, and sinks while the bottom water rises. This annual mixing ensures that the water column is well aerated, and that any gases that might seep into the bottom do not build up to dangerous concentrations. But Lake Nyos, located in a tropical region with little seasonal temperature variation, is what is known as a meromictic lake. Its waters are permanently stratified into distinct layers that do not mix. The deep, cold bottom water is much denser than the warm surface water, creating a stable and permanent stratification, like oil on top of water. This stratification was the critical factor in creating the Nyos bomb. The lake sits directly above a pocket of magma deep within the Earth's crust. Although the volcano itself is dormant, the magma is still releasing gases, primarily carbon dioxide. This CO2 seeps upwards through the rock and dissolves into the cold, deep bottom waters of the lake. Because the lake does not turn over, this process continued year after year, century after century. The deep water became a massive reservoir of dissolved CO2, held in solution by the immense pressure of the 200 meters of water above it. The situation was directly analogous to a bottle of champagne or soda. The gas is held invisibly in the liquid, kept in check by the pressure inside the sealed bottle. The deep waters of Lake Nyos had become a gigantic, naturally occurring gas cylinder, containing an estimated 1.6 million tons of dissolved CO2. With this model established, the next question was, what triggered the release? What popped the cork on this geological champagne bottle? A trigger event was needed to disrupt the stable stratification of the lake and allow the deep, CO2-saturated water to rise. As this deep water rises, the overlying pressure decreases. Just as when you open a bottle of soda, this pressure decrease causes the dissolved gas to come violently out of solution, creating a massive chain reaction. The initial bubbles make the water more buoyant, causing it to rise faster, which releases more bubbles, and so on. This runaway process results in a massive, explosive degassing of the entire lake. Scientists proposed several potential triggers for the 1986 event. One of the most likely candidates is a landslide. The walls of the crater surrounding Lake Nyos are steep and unstable. A significant landslide, either from the crater wall falling into the lake or from a submarine landslide on the steep underwater slopes, could have displaced enough water to disturb the deep layers and initiate the eruption. The loud rumbling sound reported by survivors is consistent with a major landslide. Another possibility is a small earthquake. The Cameroon volcanic line is a seismically active area, and a tremor could have been enough to destabilize the water column. A third theory suggests a weather-related cause. A period of heavy rainfall and cool weather could have cooled the surface water, making it denser and causing it to sink, potentially penetrating deep enough to disrupt the stratification. It is even possible that the gas concentration in the deep water had simply reached a critical saturation point, where a spontaneous eruption was inevitable. Whatever the specific trigger, the result was the same. A massive volume of deep water, carrying its immense load of dissolved CO2, was suddenly displaced upwards. As it rose, the pressure dropped, and the CO2 erupted out of solution with explosive force. This violent degassing propelled a huge fountain of water and gas hundreds of feet into the air, consistent with the plume that was witnessed. The eruption released a colossal cloud of CO2 gas, estimated to be over a cubic kilometer in volume. This dense, heavier-than-air cloud then flowed out of the crater and down into the valleys, displacing the oxygen and suffocating everything in its path. The scientific investigation had reached its conclusion. The strange fizzing water, the unique geology of the lake, and the condition of the victims all pointed to a single terrifying culprit: a limnic eruption of carbon dioxide. The silent killer had been unmasked. The confirmation of the limnic eruption theory was a triumph of scientific deduction, but it also carried with it a chilling new realization. The disaster was not necessarily a one-time event. The same geological conditions that had created the gas buildup in the first place were still active. The magma beneath the lake was still seeping CO2 into its depths. Scientists, upon returning to the lake in the months and years after the disaster, confirmed that the deep waters were already beginning to recharge with gas. The Nyos bomb was slowly rearming itself. The investigation had not only solved the mystery of the 1986 disaster, but it had also revealed an ongoing and imminent threat. Another, possibly even larger, eruption was not just a possibility. It was a certainty, unless something could be done to disarm the lake. The scientific investigation had ended, But a new challenge, one of engineering and intervention, was just beginning. The world now knew what had killed the people of Nios, and it was now faced with the moral and technical responsibility of ensuring that the silent, deadly cloud would never rise from the lake again. The successful scientific investigation into the Lake Nios disaster was both a triumph and a terrifying revelation. The unmasking of the Kill-era massive, explosive release of dissolved carbon dioxide from the lake's depths solved the immediate mystery of the 1986 tragedy. However, it simultaneously unveiled a far more pressing and frightening problem. The killer was still there, and it was preparing to strike again. Scientists who continued to monitor the lake in the years following the disaster confirmed that the same geological processes were relentlessly at work. Carbon dioxide was still seeping from the magma below, slowly and silently recharging the deep waters of the lake. The Nios bomb was rearming itself. It was estimated that without any intervention, the lake could reach a critical saturation point again within a few decades, leading to another, possibly even more powerful limnic eruption. The 20,000 people who lived in the surrounding valleys were living under a suspended death sentence. The world was faced with an unprecedented challenge, not just to understand a natural disaster, but to actively prevent one. This led to a remarkable international effort, a marriage of geology and engineering, to devise a solution to tame the killer lake and disarm its deadly gas charge before it could erupt again. The initial aftermath of the disaster saw the Cameroonian government, with the help of international aid agencies, declare a wide area around Lake Nios a danger zone. The surviving populations of the most affected villages were evacuated and resettled in new locations, away from the path of any potential future gas flows. While this was a necessary immediate step to protect human life, it was not a permanent solution. It did not address the root of the problem, the ongoing accumulation of CO2 in the lake. The scientific community recognized that a passive approach of simply waiting for the next eruption was unacceptable. A proactive, engineered solution was required. The challenge was immense. How could one safely remove millions of tons of dissolved gas from the bottom of a deep, unstable crater lake, without accidentally triggering the very catastrophic eruption they were trying to prevent? A number of potential solutions were proposed and debated by an international team of scientists and engineers from Cameroon, France, the United States, and other nations. Some of the early ideas were audacious and highly risky. One proposal involved dropping explosives into the lake to deliberately trigger a series of smaller, controlled eruptions to release the pressure gradually. This idea was quickly rejected as being far too dangerous and unpredictable. A small miscalculation could easily lead to a full-scale, uncontrolled disaster. Another suggestion was to pump the CO2-rich water from the bottom of the lake and inject it into deep geological formations underground, a form of carbon sequestration. This, however, was deemed to be prohibitively expensive and technically complex for such a remote location. The most promising and ultimately successful approach was a far more elegant one. A solution that aimed to use the lake's own deadly properties to save it. This was the concept of artificial degassing through a system of vertical pipes. The principle behind the degassing project was simple, yet brilliant. It relied on the same physics that caused the catastrophic eruption, but in a controlled and continuous manner. The plan was to install one or more large-diameter pipes, running from the very bottom of the lake, where the CO2 concentration was highest, up to the surface. The deep, gas-saturated water would then be lifted up this pipe. The critical insight was that the water did not need to be pumped all the way to the surface. It only needed to be lifted to a certain critical depth within the pipe. At this depth, the surrounding hydrostatic pressure would be low enough for the dissolved CO2 to begin to come out of solution, forming small bubbles. This is the point of nucleation. Once this bubbling process began, the system would become self-sustaining. The formation of gas bubbles within the water column inside the pipe would dramatically lower its overall density, making it much lighter than the solid column of water outside the pipe. This density difference would create a powerful buoyant force, causing the gas-water mixture inside the pipe to surge upwards with great speed, a phenomenon known as a gas lift. This would, in turn, draw more deep, gas-rich water into the bottom of the pipe, which would then also begin to bubble and rise. The result would be a continuous self-powered siphon, a man-made geyser that would safely and constantly transport the dangerous, CO2-laden water from the bottom of the lake to the surface. Once at the surface, the CO2 would be harmlessly released into the atmosphere in a controlled plume, while the naughty gas water would flow back into the surface layer of the lake. The plan was, in essence, to create a permanent artificial leak in the geological gas cylinder, allowing the pressure to be bled off slowly and safely, preventing it from ever reaching the critical point of explosive failure. While the concept was elegant, its implementation was a major logistical and engineering challenge. The location was remote with poor road access. The equipment had to be robust and reliable, capable of operating for years with minimal maintenance in a harsh environment. The installation itself was a delicate and potentially dangerous operation. The French team, led by scientist Michel Halboix, took the lead in designing and deploying the first degassing system. In 2001, after years of planning and preparation, the first pipe was successfully installed at Lake Nyos. The installation process involved assembling the long pipe on a series of rafts on the lake's surface, and then carefully lowering it to the bottom, a depth of over 200 meters. The initial startup of the system required a pump to prime the siphon. A pump was used to lift the first column of deep water up the pipe to the nucleation depth. The team watched with bated breath. As the water reached the critical height, the theory proved correct. The water began to fizz, then to bubble, and then, with a great roar, a spectacular fountain of water and gas erupted from the top of the pipe, shooting nearly 50 meters into the air. The pump was switched off, and as predicted, the fountain continued to flow under its own power, driven by the relentless release of the trapped gas. The first degassing pipe was a resounding success. The sound of the fountain, a constant, reassuring hiss and roar, became the sound of the lake being tamed, a symbol of science triumphing over a deadly natural threat. The single pipe, however, was not enough to fully mitigate the danger. While it was successfully removing a significant amount of CO2, scientists calculated that the rate of natural gas seepage into the lake was still greater than the rate of removal. The overall concentration of gas in the lake, though being reduced, was still at a dangerous level. More capacity was needed. After a period of further fundraising and technical development, 2 additional larger diameter pipes were installed in 2011. With these 3 pipes operating in concert, the rate of degassing finally surpassed the rate of natural recharge. For the first time since the disaster, the total amount of dissolved CO2 in Lake Nyos was definitively decreasing. The bomb was finally being disarmed. The degassing project at Lake Nyos is a landmark achievement in the field of natural hazard mitigation. It represents a rare and successful example of a large-scale geoengineering project designed to prevent a specific and well-understood geological threat. The constant, shimmering plumes of the degassing fountains are a permanent and visible testament to the power of international scientific cooperation and human ingenuity. However, the solution is not a permanent one in the sense that it can be forgotten. The pipes require regular monitoring and maintenance to ensure they do not become clogged or damaged. The political and economic stability of the region is crucial to ensuring that this maintenance continues uninterrupted for the decades it will take to reduce the gas concentration to a completely safe level. Furthermore, the degassing project only addressed one of the dangers posed by the lake. A secondary but equally serious threat remains: the integrity of the natural dam that holds the water in the crater. The northern rim of the Lake Nyos crater is not solid bedrock, but a weak and heavily eroded dam made of pyroclastic material. This natural dam is structurally fragile and is being actively eroded by the outflow of water from the lake. If this dam were to fail, it would result in a catastrophic flood that would inundate the downstream valleys, posing an even greater threat to the local population than the gas itself. Structural engineers have studied the dam and confirmed its instability, and efforts have been made to reinforce it, but it remains a significant and ongoing concern. The story of the engineering solution at Lake Nyos is therefore one of qualified success. The immediate threat of another limnic eruption has been dramatically reduced, and the lake is slowly being made safe. However, the situation requires perpetual vigilance. The fountains must be maintained, and the dam must be monitored. The disaster and the subsequent intervention serve as a powerful case study, a lesson in how human societies can and must respond to rare but devastating geological hazards. It demonstrates that with a deep scientific understanding of a problem and the political will to act, it is possible to intervene in the workings of the planet and to mitigate its most dangerous potentials. But it also reminds us that such solutions are often not final. They require a long-term commitment, a promise from one generation to the next to maintain the vigilance needed to keep the silent killer of the lake forever at bay. The harrowing disaster at Lake Nyos in 1986, and the subsequent remarkable engineering effort to tame its deadly potential, could easily be viewed as an isolated and uniquely bizarre event, a geological anomaly confined to a remote corner of Cameroon. However, to see it as such would be to miss the broader and far more chilling implications of the phenomenon. The conditions that created the Nyos bomb are not entirely unique. The tragedy served as a terrifying wake-up call to the global scientific community, prompting a search for other killer lakes that might pose a similar threat. This search has revealed that while such lakes are exceptionally rare, they do exist, and one in particular presents a potential for a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale that would dwarf the Nyos disaster. This is Lake Kivu, located in the heart of Africa's Great Rift Valley. The story of Lake Nyos, therefore, is not just a local one. It is a global warning, a case study that highlights a rare but devastating geological hazard and underscores the constant, fragile balance between human populations and the immense, hidden power of the planet. The first indication that Lake Nyos was not a complete anomaly came from Cameroon's own recent past. Just 2 years before the Nyos disaster on August 15, 1984, a smaller but eerily similar event had occurred at another crater lake, Lake Manaun, located about 100 kilometers away. On that day, a cloud of carbon dioxide was released from the lake, flowing into a low-lying area and killing 37 people. At the time, the cause of the deaths was a mystery. Local authorities, lacking scientific expertise, attributed them to everything from terrorism to supernatural causes. It was only after the much larger and more devastating event at Nyos that scientists revisited the Lake Manaun incident and realized it was a smaller precursor, a warning shot that had tragically gone unheeded. The two events, occurring in the same volcanic region, confirmed that limnic eruptions were a specific and recurring hazard of the Cameroon volcanic line. Following the Nyos disaster, Lake Manaun was also studied, and was subsequently degassed using a similar piping system, successfully mitigating the threat it posed. The discovery of 2 such lakes in the same region prompted a global assessment. Geologists and limnologists began to survey other deep, volcanically active lakes around the world, searching for the specific set of conditions required to create a killer lake. These conditions are rare and specific. First, the lake must be deep and tropical, allowing for permanent thermal stratification where the water layers do not mix. Second, it must be located in a volcanically active area, with the subterranean source of carbon dioxide that can seep into the lake's bottom waters. Third, the water must be capable of holding vast quantities of dissolved gas under pressure. The global search revealed that very few lakes on Earth meet all these criteria. There are potential candidates in places like Lake Mashu in Japan and Lake Pavin in France, but their gas concentrations are currently well below dangerous levels. The search, however, did identify one lake that not only met all the criteria but did so on a scale that was almost beyond comprehension. Lake Kivu. Lake Kivu is one of Africa's Great Lakes, situated on the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is a vast and stunningly beautiful body of water, but its serene surface conceals a danger that makes Lake Nyos seem minor in comparison. The numbers alone are staggering. Lake Kivu is nearly 2,000 times larger than Lake Nyos in surface area and is much deeper, reaching depths of almost 500 meters. Its deep waters are not only supersaturated with an enormous quantity of carbon dioxide estimated to be 300 cubic kilometers, or over 250 times the amount released at Nyos, but they also contain a huge volume of another dissolved gas, methane. The methane is produced by the biological decay of organic material under anaerobic, oxygen-free conditions in the lake's depths. This combination of CO2 and methane makes Lake Kivu a potential double threat. A massive gas eruption would not only be suffocating, but also potentially explosive if the methane were to ignite. The geological setting of Lake Kivu is also far more volatile than that of Nyos. It lies directly within the Albertine Rift, the western branch of the East African Rift Valley, one of the most tectonically active regions on the planet. The lake is flanked by active volcanoes, including Mount Nyiragongo, which is famous for its persistent lava lake and has erupted numerous times in recent history, most notably in 1977 and 2002. An eruption of Nyiragongo could easily trigger a limnic eruption in Lake Kivu, either through a major earthquake or through a lava flow entering the lake and violently disrupting the water stratification. Evidence from the lake sediment cores suggests that massive, natural degassing events, paleoeruptions, have occurred at Lake Kivu every 1,000 years or so. The lake is not just a potential threat. It is a recurring one, a ticking geological time bomb. The most critical difference, however, is the human element. While the valleys around Lake Nyos were sparsely populated, the shores of Lake Kivu are home to a dense and growing population of over 2 million people. The major cities of Goma in the Congo and Gisenyi in Rwanda are built directly on its banks. These are bustling centers of life and commerce, with millions of people living in the direct path of any potential gas cloud. A large-scale limnic eruption at Lake Kivu would not be a localized disaster. It would be a humanitarian catastrophe of almost unprecedented scale. It would be a silent, suffocating tsunami that would kill millions, a disaster that would dwarf the tragedies of Nyos and Manaun combined. Lake Kivu, therefore, represents the single greatest threat from a known limnic eruption on the planet. The ongoing danger posed by these lakes, particularly the immense threat from Lake Kivu, serves as a powerful and sobering global warning. The Lake Nyos disaster was a lesson written in tragedy, a stark reminder that the Earth possesses hidden and powerful mechanisms that can have devastating consequences for human life. It highlights the fact that our understanding of the planet is still incomplete, and that rare, high-impact geological hazards can exist where we least expect them. The story of Nyos underscores the absolute necessity of ongoing scientific research and monitoring. It was only through the dedicated work of the international scientific community that the cause of the disaster was understood, and that the ongoing threat was identified. This knowledge was the prerequisite for any attempt to mitigate the danger. The subsequent engineering solution at Nyos and Manaun also provides a model, albeit a complex and challenging one, for how such threats can be managed. The degassing project was the triumph of applied science, demonstrating that it is possible to intervene in these massive geological systems and to reduce the risk they pose. This has led to similar, though much larger and more complex, proposals for Lake Kivu. A pilot project to extract methane from the lake's depths has already been undertaken, with the dual purpose of generating electricity for the energy-starved region and reducing the overall gas concentration in the lake. However, scaling this up to a level that would significantly mitigate the danger from both methane and CO2 is a monumental technological, economic and political challenge, especially given the instability and poverty of the surrounding region. The challenge at Lake Kivu is a stark reminder that scientific knowledge alone is not enough. Mitigating these global-scale hazards requires long-term political will, international cooperation, and sustained financial investment. The degassing pipes at Nyos, for example, are not a fire-and-forget solution. They require constant maintenance and monitoring to ensure their continued operation. The natural dam that holds the lake is also a source of ongoing concern, requiring its own engineering assessments and potential reinforcement. The safety of the people living in these valleys depends on a perpetual commitment to vigilance, a promise that future generations will continue the work that was started in the wake of the 1986 disaster. In conclusion, the legacy of the Lake Nyos disaster is a profound and multi-layered one. It is a story of a terrifying natural event that brought unimaginable sorrow to a remote community. It is a story of a brilliant scientific detective investigation that unraveled a rare and complex geological mystery. And it is a story of a successful engineering intervention that has, for now, tamed a killer. But most importantly, it is a global warning. It reveals that the Earth, for all its beauty and apparent stability, still holds the capacity for sudden and catastrophic violence. The silent, invisible cloud that rose from Lake Nyos serves as a permanent reminder of the unseen forces that operate beneath our feet and the fragile balance that exists between human life and the planet's hidden geological power. The lessons learned at Nyos are now being applied to the far greater threat at Lake Kivu, in a race against geological time to prevent an even greater tragedy. The story of the killer lakes is a testament to the importance of science, the ingenuity of engineering, and the sobering reality of our vulnerability in the face of the awesome power of the natural world. The story of Lake Nyos is a terrifying lesson from the Earth itself. It reveals how unseen forces beneath our feet can erupt with deadly consequences, and highlights the fragile balance between human life and the planet's hidden geological power. Beneath a ghost town in Pennsylvania, a fire has been burning for 60 years. It started with a small trash fire and ignited an entire coal seam. Now, it's an underground inferno that may not stop for another 250 years. In the heart of Pennsylvania's anthracite coal region, nestled in the rolling hills of Columbia County, there once stood the small but proud town of Centralia. Today, the name Centralia is synonymous with a slow-motion disaster. A modern ghost town whose very ground is on fire. It has become a symbol of environmental catastrophe and a cautionary tale about the unforeseen consequences of human action. But before it became a byword for a subterranean inferno, Centralia was a real place, a living community with a history, a culture, and an identity deeply rooted in the very substance that would ultimately consume it, coal. To understand the tragedy of Centralia, one must first understand the town that was, a thriving community built upon a geological treasure, and the single seemingly insignificant event in the spring of 1962 that would accidentally ignite a fire that continues to burn to this day, and may not be extinguished for centuries to come. In the early 1960s, Centralia was a classic American coal town. Like hundreds of similar communities scattered throughout the Appalachian Mountains, its existence was inextricably linked to the rich veins of anthracite coal that lay just beneath its streets. Anthracite, often called hard coal, is a dense high-carbon form of coal that burns with very little smoke or soot, making it a highly desirable fuel for heating homes. The discovery of these vast deposits in the 19th century had transformed this part of Pennsylvania, attracting waves of immigrants from Ireland, Poland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, all seeking work in the dangerous but vital industry of mining. Centralia, founded in 1866, was born from this coal rush. It was a town built by miners for miners. The rhythm of daily life was dictated by the shift whistle of the collieries. The local economy rose and fell with the price of coal. The very air had a faint, gritty taste, and the social fabric was woven from the shared experiences of hard labor, community solidarity, and the ever-present dangers of working deep underground. At its peak, Centralia was a bustling community of over 2,500 people. It had its own schools, numerous churches representing the different ethnic groups, a post office, hotels, bars, and a vibrant main street. It was a tight-knit community where everyone knew their neighbors, and family histories were intertwined over generations. But the town's prosperity was always sitting on a precarious foundation. The ground beneath Centralia was not solid earth. It was a honeycomb, a complex and labyrinthine network of abandoned mine tunnels, shafts, and chambers left behind by a century of intensive mining. This subterranean maze, much of which was poorly mapped and long forgotten, was filled with leftover coal pillars, coal dust, and exposed seams of anthracite. The town was, in a very literal sense, built on top of its own fuel source. This geological reality, which had provided the town with its livelihood for 100 years, also made it uniquely and catastrophically vulnerable. The fateful event that would seal Centralia's doom occurred in May of 1962. The story begins with the mundane civic problem: the town's landfill. The landfill was located in an old abandoned strip mining pit on the edge of town. By the spring of 1962, it was overflowing with trash, and the town council needed to have it cleaned up before the upcoming Memorial Day celebrations. This was a routine task. The council hired 5 members of the local volunteer fire company to handle the job, allocating them a small fee. The standard procedure for cleaning up a landfill at that time, though now recognized as incredibly reckless, was to set the trash on fire to reduce its volume, and then to extinguish the remaining flames with water. On May 27, 1962, the firefighters proceeded as planned. They set the garbage ablaze and let it burn for a period of time. Afterwards, they doused the smoldering remains with water from their fire hoses. They stirred the ashes and, believing the fire to be completely extinguished, they went home. A few days later, however, flames were seen once again licking at the surface of the pit. The firefighters were called back. They spent hours dousing the area again, using much more water this time. Once again, they believed the problem was solved. But what they, and everyone else in Centralia, failed to realize was that the fire had not been extinguished. It had merely disappeared from view. The problem lay with the location of the landfill itself. The abandoned strip mine pit was not an isolated, sealed container. At the base of the pit, there was an unsealed opening, a hole that led directly into the vast, interconnected network of the old Buck Mountain coal mine that snaked its way beneath the entire town. The smoldering embers from the trash fire, unseen and unchecked, had crept downwards through this opening, like a burning fuse traveling down a wire. Deep within the pit, these embers came into contact with an exposed vein of anthracite coal. The fire, starved of oxygen on the surface but now given access to an almost inexhaustible supply of fuel and a labyrinth of tunnels to provide it with air, began to burn. It was a slow, quiet ignition deep underground. There was no explosion, no dramatic plume of smoke. The fire had started its long subterranean journey, and for a time, no one on the surface had any idea that an infernal disaster had been set in motion. The inferno that would consume a town and create a modern legend had begun, not with a bang but with a whisper. For the first few years, the underground fire was an out-of-sight, out-of-mind problem. The townspeople were aware of it, and there were some early half-hearted attempts to deal with it. But the true scale and nature of the threat were not yet understood. A mine fire is not like a forest fire. Anthracite coal is very dense and burns at extremely high temperatures, but it does so very slowly. The fire does not race through the tunnels. It creeps and smolders, advancing at a rate of only a few feet a day in some places. The initial signs of its presence were subtle and easily dismissed. Residents might notice a strange, acrid smell in their basements, or small wisps of steam venting from cracks in the ground on a cold day. These early warnings were treated more as a nuisance than as a sign of an impending catastrophe. However, as the years passed and the fire continued to spread through the labyrinth of abandoned mines, the symptoms became more severe and impossible to ignore. The ground in some areas became noticeably warm to the touch, even in winter. Lawns developed hot spots where the snow would never settle. The fire burning deep below was heating the earth from beneath, like a giant slow-cooking oven. The most dangerous and insidious threat, however, was an invisible one: the release of toxic gases. As the coal burned, it produced large quantities of carbon monoxide (CO), carbon dioxide (CO2), and other poisonous gases. These gases, being odorless and colorless, would seep up through the fractured rock and into the basements and homes of the residents. People began to complain of chronic headaches, dizziness, and nausea, classic symptoms of low-level carbon monoxide poisoning. Canaries kept as pets would mysteriously die. The very air in their homes was becoming toxic. The situation escalated dramatically throughout the 1970s, as the physical effects of the underground inferno became more visible and violent. The fire was no longer a distant theoretical problem. It was a clear and present danger. Steam and smoke began to vent from long, sulfur-stained fissures that opened up in backyards and on public land. Trees and vegetation in affected areas would wither and die, their roots literally cooked in the hot soil. Roads and sidewalks began to buckle and crack as the ground beneath them subsided. The local section of Route 61, the main highway through the town, became a notorious problem spot, constantly needing to be repaired as the heat from below warped and destroyed the asphalt. The fire was slowly and relentlessly consuming the very foundations of the town. The event that finally catapulted Centralia's plight into the national consciousness occurred on Valentine's Day in 1981. A 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard when the ground suddenly gave way beneath him. A hot, steaming sinkhole about 4 feet wide and over 150 feet deep had opened up without warning. Todd clung desperately to a tree root as the soft earth crumbled around him, plunging him into the hot, gas-filled chasm. His cousin was able to pull him to safety just in time. When a thermometer was later lowered into the hole, it registered temperatures of several hundred degrees and dangerously high levels of carbon monoxide. The incident was a terrifying and undeniable demonstration of the danger. The children of Centralia were not even safe playing in their own backyards. The story of Todd Domboski's near-death experience made national news, and the town with a fire in its belly became a subject of morbid fascination across the country. During this period, from the 1960s through the early 1980s, numerous attempts were made to extinguish the fire, but all were doomed to failure. The problem was the immense and inaccessible scale of the inferno. The fire was not a single contained blaze. It was burning along multiple fronts in a vast three-dimensional maze of abandoned mine tunnels, some of which were hundreds of feet deep. The early attempts were woefully inadequate. They involved simply digging out the burning material near the surface, a strategy that failed to address the deeper, more extensive parts of the fire. A more ambitious plan involved trying to flush the mines with water. Firefighters pumped millions of gallons of water into boreholes drilled into the mine network, but this had little effect. The sheer volume of the mines was too great, and the intense heat of the fire simply turned the water into steam. Another strategy involved attempting to smother the fire by pumping a mixture of fly ash, sand, and water into the tunnels, a slurry designed to cut off the fire's oxygen supply. This too was a failure. The fractured and collapsed nature of the old mines meant that there were countless cracks and fissures that allowed air to continue to reach the burning coal. The most technologically advanced and expensive plan involved the creation of a massive isolation trench. The idea was to dig a huge trench around the perimeter of the fire, deep enough to cut through the coal seam, and then to backfill it with a non-combustible material, effectively creating a firebreak to starve the fire of new fuel. But this plan was fraught with difficulties. The exact extent of the underground fire was difficult to map. The cost of such a massive excavation was astronomical, and the process itself was incredibly dangerous, with the risk of releasing huge plumes of toxic gas or causing further ground subsidence. After much debate and a number of failed or partial attempts, the consensus among engineers and government officials began to shift. The fire was simply too large, too deep, and too complex. It could not be extinguished at any reasonable cost. The battle to save Centralia was lost. The only remaining option was to save its people. By the dawn of the 1980s, the situation in Centralia had escalated from a local nuisance to a full-blown, slow-motion catastrophe. The underground mine fire, which had been ignited by a seemingly trivial trash fire 2 decades earlier, was now an uncontrollable subterranean inferno. The ground was literally hot beneath the residents' feet. Toxic gases seeped into their homes, and the very earth had become unstable and treacherous. The dramatic near-death of 12-year-old Todd Domboski in 1981 served as a terrifying exclamation point, a moment that shattered any remaining sense of normalcy and brought the town's plight to the attention of the entire nation. It became painfully clear that the numerous, costly, and often desperate attempts to extinguish the fire had failed. The battle against the underground blaze was lost. The focus of the state and federal governments now shifted from fighting the fire to dealing with its human consequences, a process that would be defined by a series of failed engineering solutions, growing public fear, and the ultimate, heartbreaking decision to abandon the town itself. The early attempts to combat the fire in the 1960s and 1970s were characterized by a fundamental underestimation of the problem. A mine fire is a uniquely challenging and complex phenomenon, profoundly different from a surface fire. The immense mass of the burning coal acts as a giant heat sink, making it incredibly difficult to cool down. The labyrinthine network of abandoned mine tunnels provides a near-infinite supply of oxygen, while also making the heart of the fire physically inaccessible. The early efforts, which mostly involved digging out burning material near the surface or flushing the area with water, were akin to using a garden hose to fight a volcano. They were well-intentioned but ultimately futile, failing to address the deep, creeping blaze that was the true source of the problem. One of the most ambitious of these failed attempts was the Three Trenches project. The idea was to excavate 3 massive, deep trenches around the known perimeter of the fire, creating a firebreak to prevent it from spreading further. This was a major engineering undertaking, requiring the removal of vast quantities of earth and rock. However, the project was plagued with problems. The exact extent of the fire was difficult to determine, and it soon became apparent that the blaze was far larger and deeper than initially believed. The trenches were not dug deep enough to completely cut through the burning coal seams, and the fire simply crept underneath them, continuing its relentless advance. The project was an expensive and spectacular failure, a giant, useless scar left on the landscape that served only to demonstrate the powerlessness of human engineering against the geological force they had unleashed. As the physical dangers became more apparent and the engineering solutions failed, the primary concern shifted to the health and safety of the residents. The most insidious threat was the invisible one: the constant emission of toxic gases from the fire. The slow, incomplete combustion of the anthracite coal produced a dangerous cocktail of gases, most notably carbon monoxide, CO. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas that is poisonous, even in small concentrations. It works by binding to the hemoglobin in the blood far more effectively than oxygen, essentially starving the body's tissues of the oxygen they need to function. The residents of Centralia were living in a constant, low-level cloud of this gas, which seeped up through the fractured ground into their basements and living spaces. The health effects were chronic and debilitating. People complained of persistent headaches, fatigue, dizziness, and confusion. For the elderly, the very young, or those with pre-existing respiratory conditions, the situation was even more dangerous. The local doctor began to see a significant increase in respiratory illnesses and other related health problems. The town's residents were being slowly poisoned in their own homes. The psychological toll was also immense. People lived in a state of constant anxiety, afraid of the air they were breathing and the ground they were walking on. The sense of safety and security that defines a home was completely eroded, replaced by a feeling of being under siege by an invisible enemy. The near-death of Ta Domboski in 1981 was the tipping point that transformed the situation from a local crisis into a national political issue. The dramatic story of a child being swallowed by a steaming sinkhole in his own backyard was a powerful and visceral image that the media seized upon. It made the abstract danger of the fire terrifyingly real. Suddenly, Centralia was famous, a symbol of a bizarre and horrifying environmental disaster. The intense media scrutiny and the growing public outcry put immense pressure on the state and federal governments to take decisive action. The residents of Centralia, who had felt ignored for years, were now at the center of a national debate. The problem, however, was that there were no easy solutions. The scientific and engineering consensus was now clear. Extinguishing the fire was likely impossible, and certainly not economically feasible. The cost of any comprehensive attempt to dig out or quench the entire fire was estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, with no guarantee of success. The focus shifted from extinguishing the fire to protecting the people. The government was faced with a difficult choice. Either attempt another, even more expensive and uncertain engineering solution, or accept the defeat and move the residents to safety. This led to a period of intense study and political wrangling. The U.S. Office of Surface Mining conducted a comprehensive study of the fire, drilling numerous boreholes to map its extent and monitor temperatures and gas levels. Their findings confirmed the worst fears. The fire was massive, covering hundreds of acres and burning in multiple seams at various depths. It was moving unpredictably, following the complex geometry of the old mine workings. The report concluded that the fire was completely out of control and posed a significant and ongoing threat to the health and safety of the remaining residents. Based on the amount of coal available to it, they estimated that the fire had enough fuel to burn for at least another 250 years. This stark assessment finally led to the only logical, albeit heartbreaking, conclusion. In 1984, the U.S. Congress, spurred by the tireless lobbying of Centralia residents and the advocacy of local and state politicians, passed a bill allocating more than $42 million for the Centralia Mine Fire Acquisition Program. This was not a plan to fight the fire. It was a plan to surrender to it. The program was designed as a voluntary buyout. The federal government would offer to purchase every property in the designated impact zone of Centralia at its fair market value, as if the fire did not exist. This would give the residents the financial means to relocate, to escape the danger, and to start new lives elsewhere. It was a recognition that the town itself could not be saved, and the only compassionate and responsible course of action was to help its people leave. The buyout program, while intended as a solution, had the tragic and unforeseen consequence of tearing the community apart. The decision of whether to stay or to go became a deeply personal and divisive one, splitting families, friends, and neighbors. For the majority of Centralia's residents, the offer was a lifeline. They were tired of the constant fear, the health problems, and the uncertainty. They saw the buyout as a chance to escape a deteriorating situation and to provide a safe future for their children. Over the course of the next few years, more than 1,000 residents accepted the government's offer. They packed up their belongings, sold their homes to the government, and moved away, scattering to nearby towns and across the country. For them, the pain of leaving their lifelong homes was outweighed by the promise of safety and peace of mind. However, a small but fiercely determined group of residents refused to leave. Their motivations were complex and deeply felt. Some were elderly residents who had lived in Centralia their entire lives, in homes that had been in their families for generations. The thought of abandoning their ancestral homes was simply unbearable. They were willing to accept the risks rather than be uprooted in their old age. Others were deeply skeptical of the government's motives and the severity of the danger. They had lived with the fire for 2 decades and had learned to adapt. They saw the buyout not as a compassionate offer, but as a government land grab, an attempt to get them off their land so that the mineral rights to the remaining coal could be exploited. They became known as the holdouts, a small band of residents who dug in their heels and refused to surrender their town. This division created a bitter rift within the community. Those who left were sometimes seen as giving up, while those who stayed were seen as stubborn and reckless. The once tight-knit social fabric of Centralia unraveled. The town began to empty out, creating a strange and desolate atmosphere. House by house, the community vanished. As residents moved out, the government, to prevent squatting and to remove potential hazards, began to demolish the empty houses. The process was slow and methodical. A house would be purchased, its residents would leave, and a few months later, a demolition crew would arrive and reduce the building to rubble, leaving only an empty, overgrown lot. The landscape of Centralia was transformed. What had once been a town of neat houses, tidy lawns, and bustling streets became a checkerboard of empty lots and the few remaining homes of the holdouts. The town's infrastructure began to crumble. The churches closed their doors, the local businesses shut down, and the school was eventually consolidated with the neighboring district. The social life of the town evaporated. By the early 1990s, the population had dwindled from over 1,000 to just a few dozen. The state of Pennsylvania, viewing the remaining residents as trespassers on what was now state-owned land, began legal proceedings to evict them. In 1992, the state government invoked eminent domain, officially condemning all the remaining properties in the borough. This was a legal maneuver to seize the land, effectively making the last residents squatters in their own homes. The legal battles would drag on for years, a sad and bitter final chapter in the story of a community's dissolution. The fire had not only consumed the ground beneath Centralia, it had consumed the town itself, scattering its people and erasing its presence from the map. The slow, invisible disaster had finally culminated in the complete and irreversible death of a town. The decision by the U.S. government in the mid-1980s to fund a voluntary buyout program for the residents of Centralia marked a definitive turning point in the town's tragic story. It was a moment of surrender, a formal admission that the underground mine fire was an uncontrollable force, and that the battle to save the town had been lost. The subsequent exodus of the vast majority of its population initiated the final, slow-motion death of the community. The process of abandonment was not a single, swift event, but a gradual and heartbreaking unraveling that took place over decades. It was a story of a community fractured, of homes demolished one by one, and of a place being systematically erased from the map, both physically and administratively. The final chapter of Centralia's life as a functioning town is a poignant and cautionary tale about the dissolution of a community and the stubborn resilience of a handful of individuals who refused to let their home disappear without a fight. The government buyout, which began in earnest in 1984, was a complex and emotionally fraught process. For most of the 1,000-plus residents who chose to participate, it was a decision born of fear, exhaustion, and a pragmatic desire for a safe future. They had spent 2 decades living with the constant anxiety of the fire. They had worried about the toxic gases seeping into their homes, the stability of the ground beneath their feet, and the long-term health of their children. The buyout offered them a way out. The government, through the newly created Centralia Relocation Authority, offered to purchase their homes and properties at their pre-fire, fair market value. This was a crucial and compassionate element of the program, as it recognized that the properties were, in reality, worthless, and it gave the residents the financial means to start over elsewhere without being completely ruined. The process of leaving, however, was deeply painful. This was not a mobile, transient population. Centralia was a town of deep roots, a place where many families had lived for generations. in homes that had been passed down from the grandparents who had first come to work in the mines. The exodus was a diaspora in miniature. Neighbors said goodbye to neighbors, families were split, and the dense social network that had defined the town for a century was torn apart. As each family packed their belongings and drove away for the last time, another piece of the town's soul went with them. The local schools saw their enrollment plummet, forcing them to close and consolidate with neighboring districts. The pews of the town's historic churches, once the center of community life for the various ethnic groups, began to empty. The small businesses on the main street, the grocery store, the bar, the hardware shop lost their customers one by one and were forced to shutter their doors. The town was hollowing out from the inside. As the houses emptied, the government began the methodical and surreal process of demolition. To prevent the abandoned buildings from becoming derelict hazards or attracting squatters, the state contracted crews to tear them down. The process was slow and relentless. An entire street of vibrant family homes could, over the course of a year, be reduced to a series of empty, overgrown lots. The landscape of Centralia began to transform into a strange and unsettling checkerboard of occupied houses and vacant spaces. The remaining residents would watch as the homes of their lifelong friends and neighbors were bulldozed into rubble, a constant and visible reminder that their community was disappearing around them. The once familiar sights and sounds of their town were being replaced by an encroaching silence and the inexorable return of nature. This process of managed decay was deeply divisive and created a bitter rift within the dwindling community. The decision to accept the buyout was not a simple one, and it fractured the town along lines of fear, trust, and identity. The majority who left did so out of a genuine concern for their safety and a desire to move on with their lives. They saw the fire as an undeniable and worsening threat and viewed the government's offer as a necessary and responsible solution. They could not understand why anyone would choose to stay and subject themselves and their families to the ongoing danger. On the other hand, the small but fiercely vocal group of residents who refused to leave saw the situation very differently. This group, which numbered around a few dozen families, became known as the holdouts. Their reasons for staying were varied and deeply personal. For many, particularly the elderly, it was a simple and powerful attachment to place. They had been born in Centralia, they had raised their families there, and they fully intended to die there. Their homes were more than just buildings. They were archives of their entire lives, repositories of memory and identity. The idea of abandoning that history was unthinkable, a form of spiritual death that they feared more than the physical risks of the fire. They had lived with the fire for 20 years, and they had learned to adapt. They knew which areas were hot, which basements to avoid, and they had installed carbon monoxide detectors. They felt that the dangers were localized and manageable, and that they were being forced out of their homes unnecessarily. This belief was fueled by a deep-seated distrust of the government and outside authorities. Many of the holdouts believed that the buyout was not a humanitarian gesture, but a cynical and calculated land grab. They were situated on top of one of the richest veins of anthracite coal in the world, worth billions of dollars. The theory among many of the holdouts was that the government and the coal companies had deliberately exaggerated the dangers of the fire as a pretext to get the residents off the land cheaply. Once the town was empty and the properties were under state control, they believed the mineral rights could be sold to a mining company, which would then open a massive strip mine to get at the valuable coal, a process that would be much easier without a town in the way. They saw themselves not as reckless stubborns, but as freedom fighters, Davids battling a Goliath of government and corporate interests, defending their property rights and their homes. This deep division created a toxic atmosphere in the final years of the town's life. The holdouts felt abandoned and betrayed by their former neighbors who had left. The former residents, in turn, often viewed the holdouts as irrational and as an obstacle to the final resolution of the crisis. The government, for its part, grew increasingly frustrated with the remaining residents. They saw them as a liability, a group of people who were willfully living in a designated disaster zone, creating ongoing legal and safety responsibilities for the state. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, the official campaign to erase Centralia from the map intensified. The state government, viewing the holdouts as illegal occupants of condemned land, began a long and bitter legal battle to evict them. In 1992, the governor of Pennsylvania invoked the power of eminent domain, a legal principle that allows the government to seize private property for public use. This act officially condemned all the remaining properties in the borough, effectively making the last residents trespassers in the homes they had owned for decades. The state offered them a final buyout, which they refused. The legal battle that ensued was a sad war of attrition, pitting a handful of determined families against the full legal and financial power of the state. The administrative erasure of the town continued. The U.S. Postal Service, citing the dwindling population, officially revoked Centralia's zip code, 17927, in 2002. Mail could no longer be addressed to Centralia, Pennsylvania. The town had been, for all practical purposes, wiped off the map. The few remaining residents were now living in a ghost town, a place with no official existence. The streets were still there, but most of the houses were gone. The sidewalks led to nowhere. The streetlights had been turned off. It was a place defined by what was no longer there. The legal fight of the holdouts dragged on for another decade. They argued passionately in court that their homes were on stable ground, far from the most active parts of the fire, and that the government had no right to seize their property. They became symbols of a certain kind of rugged American individualism, champions of property rights against government overreach. Finally, in 2013, a settlement was reached. In a surprising victory for the remaining residents, the state of Pennsylvania agreed to allow the last handful of them, fewer than 10 people at that point, to live out the rest of their lives in their homes. As part of the settlement, they were paid a small cash sum and were granted the official deeds to their properties. However, the agreement stipulated that once the last of these residents passes away or chooses to leave, their property will revert back to the state through eminent domain. There would be no new generation of Centralians. The settlement was not a reprieve for the town. It was a life estate for its last few citizens, a final compassionate compromise that allowed the story of Centralia to end not with a forced eviction, but with the quiet fading of its last inhabitants. The abandonment of Centralia was, therefore, a uniquely slow and complex process, a story of government action, community division, and fierce personal resistance, a tragedy that played out over 30 years and culminated in the almost complete erasure of a once vibrant American town. Today, Centralia, Pennsylvania, exists more as a concept than as a place. It is a modern ghost town, a landscape defined by absence and haunted by the memory of what once was. The fire that was ignited by a careless act in 1962 continues to burn, a slow, relentless inferno creeping through the subterranean labyrinth of abandoned mines. It is a geological process that will likely continue for another 2.5 centuries, a permanent and dramatic feature of the local environment. For the outside world, Centralia has become a destination for morbid curiosity, a touchstone in popular culture, and a powerful symbol of a man-made environmental disaster. But beyond its status as a ghost town, the story of Centralia serves as a profound and sobering warning, a case study in a global phenomenon of underground coal fires that pose a significant, though often invisible, threat to communities and the environment around the world. To visit Centralia today is to step into a strange and unsettling landscape where nature is actively reclaiming a human space. The neat grid of streets laid out by the town's founders is still there, but it is a skeleton. The houses that once lined these streets are almost all gone, demolished and hauled away decades ago. In their place are empty, overgrown lots where deer graze and wildflowers bloom. The sidewalks crack and heave, pushed upwards by the roots of returning trees. Here and there, a lone fire hydrant stands sentinel on a corner, a rusting relic of a municipal infrastructure that no longer serves a purpose. The most iconic and visceral evidence of the fire's presence are the steam vents. On a cold or damp day, plumes of steam and gas, smelling faintly of sulfur, rise from fissures and boreholes in the ground, a constant, visible reminder of the immense heat raging just a few hundred feet below. It is a landscape that is simultaneously peaceful and deeply menacing. For years, the most famous landmark of this ghost town was the Graffiti Highway. This was a 0.75-mile stretch of the old Route 61, the main road that once ran through the heart of Centralia. The highway was abandoned in the early 1990s after the ground beneath it became dangerously hot and unstable, causing the asphalt to buckle, crack, and split into great fissures. Over the years, this derelict stretch of road became a spontaneous canvas for thousands of visitors. It was covered from end to end in a thick, constantly changing layer of colorful graffiti, a vibrant and chaotic explosion of art in the midst of a decaying landscape. It became a pilgrimage site for urban explorers, artists, and tourists, a strange and beautiful monument to the town's demise. In 2020, however, the owners of the land, citing safety and liability concerns, made the decision to bury the Graffiti Highway, covering the entire stretch with tons of earth. The act was a controversial one, seen by some as the erasure of a unique piece of folk art, and by others as a necessary step in the final, quiet closure of the Centralia story. Amidst this landscape of decay and reclamation, a tiny spark of the original community persists. As of the early 2020s, a handful of residents, fewer than 5, still live in Centralia. These are the last of the holdouts, the survivors of the long legal battle with the state. As part of the 2013 settlement, they were granted the right to live out the rest of their lives in the homes their families have occupied for generations. They are a small, resilient, and intensely private community, living a quiet life in a town that officially no longer exists. They are surrounded by empty lots and the encroaching forest, a tiny island of persistence in a sea of abandonment. Their presence is a poignant testament to the power of home and the stubborn human refusal to be erased. But their victory is a temporary one. The terms of their settlement are clear. Once the last of these residents passes away or chooses to move, their property will be seized by the state, and the final, living link to the old town of Centralia will be extinguished forever. The story of Centralia, while dramatic and unique in its specifics, is a powerful local example of a much larger, global phenomenon. The underground fire that is consuming Centralia is not a singular anomaly. There are, at this very moment, thousands of such coal-seam fires burning uncontrollably all around the world. They are a hidden and often ignored environmental crisis, a legacy of 2 centuries of intensive coal mining. These fires can be ignited in a number of ways: by lightning strikes, by forest fires spreading to exposed coal seams, by spontaneous combustion in old mine workings, or, as in the case of Centralia, by human carelessness. Major coal fire disasters have been recorded in countries across the globe. In China, which has the world's largest coal mining industry, it is estimated that hundreds of fires are burning, consuming tens of millions of tons of coal each year and releasing vast quantities of greenhouse gases and toxic pollutants into the atmosphere. In India, the town of Jharia has been burning for over a century, a slow-motion disaster that has caused widespread land subsidence and forced the relocation of hundreds of thousands of people. In Germany's Ruhr Valley, in Australia and South Africa, and in Indonesia, similar fires smolder, a persistent and costly legacy of the industrial age. These fires represent a significant and often underestimated environmental threat. They are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. The slow, inefficient burning of underground coal releases immense amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than CO2, and carbon monoxide into the atmosphere, contributing to global climate change. They also release a host of other toxic pollutants, including sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and heavy metals like mercury and arsenic, which can contaminate the air, soil, and groundwater for miles around the fire zone. The impact on local ecosystems can be devastating, destroying vegetation and poisoning water sources. The human cost is also immense. As seen in Centralia, the fires can make entire areas uninhabitable, forcing the permanent relocation of communities and causing the loss of homes, farms, and infrastructure. The constant release of toxic gases poses a serious long-term health risk to anyone living nearby. The subsidence and sinkholes created by the fire burning out the ground from below are a constant and unpredictable physical danger. Yet, despite their severity, these fires often burn in remote, rural areas and receive little of the media attention or government resources that are devoted to more dramatic, fast-moving disasters like hurricanes or earthquakes. They are a quiet, creeping crisis, a problem that is literally and figuratively buried. Centralia serves as a perfect case study in why these fires are so difficult to combat. The cost of extinguishing a major underground fire is almost always astronomically high, often running into the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. The engineering challenges are immense. As the failed attempts at Centralia showed, simply pouring water on the fire is ineffective. Digging out the burning material is a colossal undertaking that is only feasible for very shallow fires. Creating isolation trenches is incredibly expensive and often fails if the fire's full extent is not perfectly mapped. The complex, fractured, and often unmapped nature of old mine workings makes it nearly impossible to seal off the fire from its oxygen supply. In most cases, as with Centralia, the only economically viable solution is to simply give up, to evacuate the affected area and let the fire burn itself out, a process that can take centuries or even millennia. The story of Centralia is therefore a haunting and powerful warning. It is a symbol of a man-made disaster unfolding in geological time. It began with a small mundane act of carelessness, the incomplete extinguishing of a trash fire, and metastasized into an unstoppable force of nature, a permanent feature of the landscape. The fire that still burns beneath its empty streets is a stark reminder that the consequences of our actions are not always immediate or obvious. Sometimes the most devastating results are the ones that smolder slowly, silently, and almost forever. Centralia is a monument to a forgotten community, a testament to the destructive power hidden within the earth, and a potent symbol of a global environmental challenge that continues to burn, largely unseen, right beneath our feet. Centralia is a haunting symbol of a man-made disaster in slow motion. The fire beneath its streets is a stark reminder that sometimes the most devastating consequences of our actions are the ones that burn slowly, silently, and almost forever. Thanks for exploring with Ancient Relics Keeper. Stay curious, question everything, and remember the truth is often buried deeper than we think.